the city of Jericho. You have Joshua and conquering all the cities around them. You've got David, thank you, and conquering all the Philistines at that time and all the destruction that God brought about. And pretty much every prophecy in the Old Testament, every prophet who wrote a prophecy in the Old Testament talks about the destruction or the fury or the wrath of God. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Malachi, Zechariah, all of them discuss or speak about or mention the wrath of God. So the wrath of God is there, but it's how we perceive it or how we understand what the wrath of God is, which makes a difference to us. So how do you guys, if I said to you the wrath of God, how do you guys perceive that? What's your understanding? If I said to you, explain to me the wrath of God, what do you understand? Sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry, can't hear.
His wrath of God is really about. So why is it often that we find people are always against such a always have a negative feeling towards the word wrath of God? It's a concern trying to protect God from certain attributes that he has.
Yep.
Why do you think?
So I'm going to get to that in a sec. just jumping a little bit ahead of me. No, we're literally about to cover that. But I just want to know, before I tell you guys what the church's understanding of the wrath of God is what's your perspective or what's your thoughts on the wrath of God? What we as humans, when you hear of the wrath of God, what perspective do you think of? What comes to mind? Judgment, yeah. What else? Yep. Perfect. What else? That's good. What else do you guys think of when you think of the wrath of God?
A way to discipline.
A way to discipline, okay. So we've got judgment, punishment, a way to discipline. Does anybody think of it as love? Just as a question. No. Good. Excellent. That's good. I like that. Okay. So exactly what you guys have just been mentioning is pretty much what I think every human has envisioned the wrath of God to be. What we do though as humans is we rationalize God to the way we think as humans. So for example, I'm a human being, which means I'm an emotional being, which means I'm happy and doing my thing and I'm all good. And then all of a sudden you do something to upset me. Therefore, my emotions and my mentality changes towards you, and therefore I seek out revenge, punishment. I'm offended. I become offendable. Okay? And so when, unfortunately, we think the same way about God, and it's our nature because it's so hard for us to think of something outside of who we are, of what we are. But we think of God in the same way. We think that, God has been offended as if he's some kind of offendable being by us sinning or by somebody doing something wrong or whatever. And so he's out to get revenge. He's out to seek blood. He's out to justify or bring forth a vengeance for himself so that he's back on equal status with us, or that he's on the same level. Because when you feel offended, when you've been humbled or lowered or somebody's insulted you, you want to come back to the same level. You've been dropped. And so to come back to the same level is to seek out revenge, to seek out justice, to get to a point where you feel you're back on level ground, in a sense. Justice, yeah, perfect, right? This is how we perceive, that's how we deal with things. And I think that's how humanity deals with God. We think of God's wrath as God lashing out to get revenge. And this, it's as if God is offendable, as if God could be offended, and we've pushed his buttons. Like, I've pushed God's buttons enough that now he's like, nah, that's it. Enough's enough. This guy's got to go, or this guy's got to be put in his place. And this is not the perspective. Well, let me go back one step. with this kind of thinking that God is an offendable being, that he can be at one stage acting in one way and then another acting in a different way. And by that, I mean, lots of people say, well, the God of the Old Testament was violent, cruel, and very vengeful, right? Because we see of all these stories of destruction. And then we go to the New Testament and go, oh, God of the New Testament is all about peace and love, and we have the Holy Spirit, and therefore God is not vengeful because we don't see massive destruction of people and floods and fire, coming down from heaven and destroying people. And so we get this perspective, or people have this thought in their mind that the God of the Old Testament was a vengeful God, and therefore he's changed in the New Testament to not be such a vengeful God. Now, this is absolutely incorrect, right? Because if we believe that, then we have to believe that God is changeable. And we know St. Paul says in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we have in the liturgy of St. Gregory, in the prayer of the anaphora, I think I wrote it. The prayer of the anaphora, it says, so straight after when Abuna says it is fitting and right, it says, it is fitting indeed and right that we praise you, bless you, serve you, worship you, the one, the only true lover of mankind, the ineffable, the invisible, infinite, without beginning, everlasting, timeless, immeasurable, incomprehensible, unchangeable. Right? So we have this firm belief that God is unchangeable, that God does not change just because circumstances change. We as humans are very changeable. I can go from being very happy one state to being very angry 2 seconds later, to being very joyful again 3 seconds later, right? We go through emotions because we're emotional beings. We can change all the time. However, God is not in the same category as us. He's a being who is unchangeable. And therefore, God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. And so for us to say that God in the Old Testament was vengeful and God in the New Testament is not vengeful is to completely deny the being of who God is, or to say that he has become different to who he is. Yes.
I'm actually discussing this, exactly this, a couple of days with my family. And, we're saying, why do we see in the Old Testament all this, actions of violence, and the New Testament no? I think the answer is because the New Testament spans a very short period of time compared to the Old Testament, which covers thousands of years basically. And actually, even when you look at the book of Revelation, which covers history and prophecy, you hear about God punishing certain cities and his wrath and his vengeance, the same language of the Old Testament. So I think it's not really different.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I think it's just the perspective that we have. We read the Old Testament and see destruction, and then read the New Testament and don't see destruction, and we think that God has changed. But the church's view is quite different to this. The church has a very firm view that that God's wrath is never oriented towards his people. Right? Just think about what I've just said. That God's wrath is not oriented towards his people. And so that should start raising a question in your mind. But I'll answer it in a second. And the reason for that is that God is known as, in Coptic, Minor Sheri. Does anybody know what Minor Sheri means? It's a Coptic word. Say it in the liturgy all the time. We attribute it to St. Anthony the Great. We say Minor Sheri is lover of mankind, right? So God is the lover of mankind. And as God is the lover of mankind, his love is there for all time, and it is always the same, and he's unchanging. Therefore, his wrath is never directed against his people. It's never directed at a certain person. And so one of the fathers explains it like this. He says, God in his being, who is stable and unchanging, is light. God is light, and he has no darkness in him. And he comes in the world, or he comes to the world, and he sees evil, and evil is darkness. And so you have this conflict between light and darkness, and right at this intersecting point is a byproduct of this battle between light and darkness, good and evil. and this is known as the wrath of God. At this point, it is a consequence of a clash between good and evil. And that might not make sense at this stage, but it will make sense in a few more minutes, I hope. Okay, so keep that in your mind, that light and darkness come to fight, come to a point of conflict, and the consequence of that battle is wrath, or the wrath of God. Okay, so the question then that should come to your mind is, if the wrath of God is not directed against us, what is the wrath of God directed against? What is the point of the wrath of God? Was it directed against, and what is its aim? So again, I pose the question to you guys: what is the wrath of God directed against? If it's not us, because I'm saying to you that He's the lover of mankind, and that He doesn't direct His wrath at us, or this consequence, this byproduct of the battle between good and evil, between light and dark. Where does this consequence direct itself towards, if it's not towards us? I've answered it in the
towards evil, towards correction.
Towards evil, exactly right. So the wrath of God is not directed at humanity; it is directed at evil. And at times, that may be the evil that resides within humanity. And so the wrath of God, even though it's directed at evil, might sometimes look like it's facing or is being directed towards mankind, towards certain people. To explain this, or to make it a bit more simpler, St. Gregory of Nazianzus gave a really nice analogy, which was way too complex to try and read it in the old English that I found it in. So I'm going to paraphrase it completely and change it a little bit to make a bit more sense. We've got doctors. Any other doctors around the place? We've got one doctor. Okay. So doctors will understand this really well, right? When you get a patient who comes in and he's got cancer, right? So you decide, I need to get rid of this cancer as a doctor. What do? What's the treatment? What's number one treatment, John? Let's just say he's got whatever. He's got a leukemia. Number one protocol treatment. You're not going to treat him. Send them out, done. No, number one, like a patient who has cancer, they undergo massive amount of trauma to their body. They undergo chemo, first of all, or a stem cell transplant, bone marrow transplant, whatever it may be, right? They undergo huge amounts of torture to their body, to the extent that you wipe out their cells. They lose their hair, they lose weight, they become fatigued, they vomit, they get sick, they feel absolutely horrible for periods of time, extended periods of time, right? And if it's a tumor, for example, the doctor will gladly cut open a person, rip them open to extract the tumor out from this person, right? Now, would you classify that as violence to that person? Do we classify that as violence to that person? No, everybody's shaking their heads. No one would classify that as violence to that person. Why?
Intended for good purpose.
It's the purpose behind it is to remove the evil. And so the wrath of God, the church sees it in the same perspective. God does not direct his wrath towards us to destroy us or to kill us. He directs it towards us to remove the evil that's within us. However, we see a cancer patient undergoing huge amounts of violence done to their body for their treatment, and we say, oh, good, it's good for them, it's important, they have to do it, be strong and whatever. And then we face a little bit of the wrath of God because God wants to turn us from the way of evil that we're living in, and we kick up the biggest fuss, and we dare to even call God evil and put this whole twist on it that God's wrathful towards us and God is vengeful and God is evil and he's trying to destroy me. We get this perspective, and we even so much so that we look in the Bible, we see God destroy people in the Old Testament, and we go, oh man, God in the Old Testament was oh man, you couldn't deal with him. He was just, you do the wrong, bang, you're dead, you're gone, right? But we've forgotten the concept. We don't understand the true meaning of the wrath of God, in that it is intended to cure, to heal, to bring about the destruction of evil from that person. Therefore, the wrath of God or the wrath that is inflicted by God is a therapy, not a punishment. Even though you guys were mentioning the first thing when we thought of wrath of God was punishment. We thought of judgment, we thought of punishment. But that's not its intention. That's not what God is there for. It's not for punishment. It's not for judgment. It's there as a therapy. Just like a doctor administers chemo to treat a cancer patient, so God administers his wrath to treat our sinful and wicked soul. And so we need to begin to change our perspective of the wrath of God. So to give you another example, what's the most vivid or like famous story in the Old Testament of the destruction of God or the wrath of God? You guys would know this. Everybody knows this story. Every time you talk about the wrath of God in the Old Testament, it's like one particular story comes into mind. No, not Joshua. Sodom and Gomorrah. Perfect, right? So, like, Sodom and Gomorrah is the epitome of the wrath of God. God goes in, his angels come in, he just rains fire upon the whole city and wipes out the whole city, right? Destroys everybody, pretty much, right? And so we look at it and we go, oh, God's wrathful, God's evil, God is, he's vengeful, kind of thing. But what I want to do is I want to take you back just before the conversation, just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Does anybody know what happens just before it? Who does God go and see? Abraham. He goes and sees his friend. He says, because the Bible calls Abraham God's friend. So he goes to Abraham and he says, I will not hide, I'm paraphrasing, I will not hide my will from Abraham. I'll tell him what I'm going to do. So when he sees God walking past and he goes, where are you going? He goes, I'm going down to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Abraham is moved by love and he says, God, if you find 50 righteous people in the city, will you destroy them so that, you're counting the righteous and the wicked as if they're the same? And he goes, look, Abraham, for your sake, if I find 50 righteous, I won't destroy the whole city. I'll leave them alive. And so Abraham, as a very good Middle Eastern bargainer, he starts bargaining with God. He starts going, all right, God, 50, okay, would you do it for 40? And he haggles with God. And he brings God down to what? 10. He brings God down to a city of righteous people in the city. Will you spare the whole city? And he goes, Abraham, if I find 10 righteous people, I will save the whole city. I will not destroy it. And so what does that say about God? Like, what does it say about this being who we're calling wrathful, who we're saying, is vengeful, who's after, the destruction of people, when just before it, he's willing to spare the whole city for the sake of just 10 righteous people? Can you imagine God comes into Adelaide and goes, I'm going to destroy it, and he's looking for 10 righteous people, and he couldn't even find that? So this is God trying to bring about the salvation of mankind. And so we see here that, we call God a vengeful being, a wrathful being. But just before it, he's explaining that I actually love these people. I have no means, I do not wish this destruction on. And he says that in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, he says, as I live, says the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but in the death of a sinner. And this makes its way again into the Gregorian liturgy. If you guys haven't realized by now, I love the Gregorian liturgy and you should really go and listen to it. It's very beautiful liturgy. But just before the prayer of the fraction, the priest stands up in a very nice long tune and he says, for you are God the merciful, who desires not the death of a sinner, but rather that he return and live. And it's pulled directly out of the Bible. God himself says, as I live, as he's making a promise. By my own self, I have promised. I swear that I do not desire the death of a sinner. And so he's saying, I take no pleasure in the death of a sinner. I take no pleasure in cutting up, my people so that I may remove the cancer from them. I take no pleasure in doing this violence towards them. But if it comes to a battle between myself and evil, I have to remove the evil. I have to fight the evil. And so God doesn't waver. He doesn't say, well, it's going to put them offside. They're not going to like me, so therefore I'm going to let them live in their sin and die. No, he loves us too much that he's willing to inflict torture and pain on us so that he may heal us. It's just like, a father or a mother who sees their son or their daughter, and they see that they're doing something that's destructive or something that's, I see my son about to do something that's not good for him, and I draw him away from it. And yes, it's torturous to pull him away and drag him, but it's for his own good because I love him. And so it's the same thing with God. Even though we don't realize it, it's because he loves us so much that he is willing to allow us to go through some torture, through some suffering, in order to save us, in order to remove the evil that exists within us. Is this point really, really clear? Because that's the heart of everything we're talking about today. Does this point differentiate in your mind God, or differentiate the concept of the wrath of God in your mind? Yes.
In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, there must be another purpose for the rest of the destruction, because he didn't even have a chance to fix himself, so to speak.
Who doesn't have a chance to fix himself? Sorry.
Like, for example, in most cases, the wrath of God is intended to fix us. But for Sodom and Gomorrah's case, the wrath of God came, and that was their end, so to speak. They didn't even have time to repent. So there must have been another purpose for God's wrath, maybe to give you an example, maybe for them to end the sufferings that they're causing to the children or to the people. So, yeah, I'm not
sure. Yeah, no, I agree. And I knew someone was going to ask a similar question to this, right? Is that we are not God, so we don't know the purpose of why he does what he does. But like you said, it could be that, they were affecting other people across, that they were beginning to spread and causing more problems. And you could see that in Lot. Lot began to change, even though he went in very righteous. By the end, he left. And even the Bible says in St. Paul, he says the terrible things that man suffered in that city was horrendous. You don't know the purpose of why God does what he does, but we know that it's out of love. There's a reason why he did it. And, maybe there was, I don't know. I can't speak on God's behalf, but. Yeah, we can't speak on, and we'll mention that in a little bit. So it's very amazing that, we always have this perspective of God as this vengeful, offendable being when bad things happen to us, when we see terrible things happening to us, and we lose concept that this is a God who loves us. This is a God who sent his only begotten Son into the world. This is a God whose Son died on the cross, and while he's on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. This is a God who saw the sinners, saw the Samaritan, who saw the tax collector, and wasn't offended by their sin, but drew closer to them and called them in to be chosen people. So the purpose of God's wrath is always to fix, is always to heal, is always to bring back. It is always to allow us to draw closer to him, not for our destruction. And so we need to get that concept out of our head, that concept that this violence that God does towards us is not for me, it's exactly for you. It's for your own benefit. And so this leads us to the next question I want to ask you, which could be a bit of controversial topic, but you guys don't talk much, so this will be easy. Is COVID, this crisis we're going through, the doing of God? Is this God's wrath? It's a very, I've asked 4 people so far, like when I was preparing, and I had four different responses, and I got into a fight with somebody. So I'm interested in knowing your concept, your thoughts. What do you guys think? Yeah. Yeah. So we got 2 people saying it's God's wrath. What else do you guys? Huh? Sorry? The Chinese wrath. Oh, man, we're online. Don't get me in trouble, man. This is beginning to sound like Trump. I'm not involved. I'm not involved. We'll do a vote. We'll do a vote, right? Don't worry, no one online can see you guys. So put hands up who says it's God's wrath. Okay. And hands up who says it's not God's wrath. Okay. There's a few people who didn't put their hands up. Is that right? China. That's not God's. That's not God's wrath. Okay. So, my point of view. I think it is very, very difficult and very, very wishy-washy to attribute things to God that we have no knowledge of. In order to speak on God's behalf, to be a spokesman for God, you pretty much have to be a prophet. It is the gift of prophecy that they would stand up, the prophets would stand up and say, the Lord said, and then they deliver what God said to them, right? So it's very hard and it's very dangerous, but I tricked you guys because I didn't give you a third option. But the point is, it's very difficult for us to know what's God's wrath and what's not. And if it's God's wrath and not God's wrath, it's like, how do you determine what's from God and what's not from God? Like when it comes to wrath, it's very difficult. Like if I said to you, September 11th, from God or not from God? Yeah, like was God using the terrorists to wake up the Americans? I don't know. Like, huh? What? I'm not even gonna. I don't even know what you're talking about. Like you got the 21 martyrs of Libya. God's wrath or not God's wrath? The shootings, the multiple school shootings in America. God's wrath, not God's wrath. You don't know. Like the burning of the churches on Palm Sunday. God's wrath or not God's wrath?
Because you said, is it God's glory?
Yeah, is it God's wrath?
Oh. Do you mean
they're both? Yeah, like they're synonymous. They're both the same thing, I think.
I don't think it's the same thing. God can use a bad situation and it's not his glory. So it must have something.
No. I'm talking about God, like for example, with COVID, that God directly came or decided to, this person is going to get infected, and I've put the infection in this person, and it's going to spread. That's what we're talking about when we're saying God's doing, or like God is directly responsible for this thing. I'm not talking about as a consequence of man's action. Lots of things are a consequence of man's action, right? COVID's probably a consequence of man's action. I don't know, right? But to have the ability to say God did this 100%, I'm sure. That's what I'm asking the question. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to be a spokesman on God's behalf. We're not prophets, and I don't know many prophets. I don't know any prophets these days that can say I've directly heard from God that he is taking responsibility for this. You know how like a terrorist, they perform a terrorist act and then one of them gets up and says, yeah, we did it, right? Like he's a spokesman for the group. Like we can't be spokesmen for God. We're not prophets. We don't know God's action or God's will. We don't know how to interpret it. And so it's very hard for us to put our finger on something and go, yep, that's 100% God's work, right? Do you guys agree with that or disagree? Because John, you're giving me mixed messages, man.
Yeah. Of what are clearly man-initiated events is not, it can be very confusing. Right?
Okay.
I think it's best to stay away from those kind of examples.
Okay. Give me an example.
That's out. I think what's clearly a man-made event, I think that therefore can confuse a very big audience that may not understand what the point of the message is.
But in the Old Testament, we have, for example, when David sinned, when he counted the people and God told him, I choose between three punishments. One of them was a plague, one of them sent an army against him to be punished. I don't remember to be the third case, but two of them, it seems to be that it's man initiated, but it seems that God can even initiate people to do certain things. Like, for example, when the Israelites went to captivity in Babylon, it seems to be that an evil nation, the Babylonians, came and did an evil act. But actually, before that happened, God sent prophets and said, I am sending you an army to do this because you've sinned and so on. So, yes, it is man initiated, was true. But it have God behind it. It could be because God is in control of so many things beyond our imaginations. It could be God.
I agree. I think at the end of the day, like terrorists getting in a plane, calling out Allah, they might think they're doing it in God's interests. They're not. I mean, that's a very clear, documented modern day event. All I'm trying to suggest is that examples are, I think, just important to which, being selective with examples that we should.
Yep.
Because then otherwise we get off point.
Definitely.
But I think what you're saying is 100% correct.
Yeah.
God doesn't speak in my English, so this is not about to do tomorrow, the same way they did with Abraham in the Old Testament, the same way that we appear to people in the Old Testament or the Bible. They don't seem to be, I'm not going to use more with, but it's very hard for us to know and say, yes, 100%, this is a value we share with respect.
Definitely. I agree 100%. So therefore, the whole idea of asking you that question was to actually get you to a point of understanding there is no, in my opinion, and you guys can disagree with me, there is no benefit, not much benefit, in asking, is this from God or not? Is this the wrath of God or not? There is no benefit in it. You don't gain anything. What's more important, what's more beneficial is the second step, is the solution, is the reason of why it's happened. So every consequence, whether it's from man, whether it's from God, whether it's from whatever, right? The consequence is to bring man closer to God, is to remove evil from the world. It's like us throwing lemon and God making lemonade out of it, right? God makes, it will take evil, will take whatever situation happens in the world, and he'll give it an opportunity to be a source for good. And so you can be, while we can never be 100% sure whether it's from God or whether it's from man or whatever, you can be 100% sure of the solution. And the solution is always that it is a therapy by whatever means. Even if God didn't instigate it, he uses it as a therapy, as a means of us having a solution or having a ability to draw back towards him. And so this is the point to be had about the wrath of God, is that, like we were saying, it is not there for the destruction of man. The wrath of God, understood in the Coptic Orthodox Church, is the ability or the opportunity to return to God. It's the opportunity that God is saying, I love you, return to me. It is the opportunity to get on your knees and pray. It is the opportunity to rekindle a relationship with God, to reconnect, to repent, to have a more intimate relationship with God. And that is the point of the wrath of God. And so, like we were talking about at the beginning, light versus darkness and the consequences, the wrath. The wrath is there so that we get on our knees and allow God to destroy the darkness, the evil within us, or whatever is happening around us, so that we can then be able to stand with him. Because you have to be 100% certain that light and darkness cannot coexist. God cannot coexist with evil. It just cannot happen. It's against his nature. It's an offense to his nature. And so therefore, that's why there's always this conflict. And therefore, God always allows his wrath as a consequence of his battle with evil, so that we may draw closer to him. And that's the real point to be had. That's the real point that we as Coptic Orthodox need to understand. It's not about, God is mean or God is whatever. It's not about, where did it come from? Who did it? Whatever, that's for the politicians, that's for the people out there, that's for whatever. But for us as Coptic Orthodox, as people who love God, we need to always keep our eye open, so that when we see the wrath of God, when we see, actions that might not always please us, their point is that should trigger in your mind, God is asking me to turn back. God is allowing me an opportunity to repent. Because if you look at COVID-19, you go, there are people who didn't have that opportunity, right? And that's God's doing. And we're not here to discuss why God allowed certain people to die and why he did allow us not to die. But, we have to get to a point where you say, I recognize that this is God's will. I recognize that this is an opportunity. God is calling me to return to Him. He's not calling me to just keep living in my constant way. And the fathers explain it like a father who loves his child will discipline him if he loves him. If I didn't love my son, I will let him fall down the stairs and khalas, let him get hurt and whatever. But if I love my child, I will discipline him. I'll stop him from doing the wrong. And if that means I have to, lock him away in the room for 5 minutes till he understands that this is wrong, then so be it. Yes, I'm inflicting a bit of pain and torture on him for a period of time, but it's out of love. It's not out of destruction. It's not out of to end him and have nothing to do with him. And so we always say, and St. Peter says it very well, he says, God disciplines those whom he loves. God disciplines his children. And we have to have that mentality on our mind that the wrath of God, the disciplining of God is for our salvation, not for our destruction. It's an opportunity for us to return to God, to bow down our knees, to worship Him and to return into fellowship with Him. And glory be to God forever. Amen. Any questions, arguments, disagreements? Yes.
I'm just thinking about like everything you're saying, kind of relate back to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, yep.
Yeah, and I was wondering, like when those people realized that, they were all, dying in the next few destroying people like that, did they understand that that was God's will?
It's a good question. I wasn't there, so I'm not entirely sure. It's a tough one. It's not very clear. We know that Lot left, and that God, the angels told him leave and don't look back, and his wife looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. Whether the people at the time knew it, you could ask the same thing of Noah during the flood. You could ask the same thing. Did the people realize they were being flooded and that they were going to be destroyed? Obviously they did. Did they know it's from God? Most likely. When you see fire raining down from heaven, you start believing that God is destroying us. But as to the rest of it, I don't know. I don't know if I believe, and this is just my own belief, that God is merciful and loving and kind, and that everybody has an opportunity at one stage or another to know Him and to return to Him, and God offers that opportunity. Maybe Lot was sent there to be the light to that city so that they all may return, and instead it went the complete opposite way, and that was their opportunity. I don't know. We can't talk hypotheticals about things that we just, like it'd be like trying to be a spokesman for God again, and I wouldn't be able to. But I believe that God would have given everybody an opportunity. Like He's very loving, and as He says, Yanni, He doesn't desire the death of a sinner or of a wicked person, but they return. Sometimes people get to a point where there is no return, and the consequence of their actions is death. I'm not sure though to answer.
I was asking like, in that case, was the 40% still like for them to return, or like that's what I think.
Yeah.
Angels.
They tried to sin. I think I hesitate to say it, but there it gets to a point where there is no return. And so God says, in order, for example, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but as an example, right, we'll go back to the doctor and the cancer. If you've got a part of your limb, part of your arm is necrosing and it's deteriorating, and there's no means of salvaging it, it's better to cut it off and not let it spread to the rest of the body than let it spread and destroy the whole body. And so maybe for that point, God said, that's it. Sodom and Gomorrah is beyond hope. All they're going to do is bring more misery and turn the rest of the world evil. And so therefore they need to end. I don't know. I'm just, yeah. That makes the most logic to me, but yeah.
there's a similar scenario with Arius. So Arius was, Peter was told by Christ not to accept Arius anymore. And then the third after him came and he accepted Arius, and soon after he passed away. And the next pope, held another council or something, and then proved that Arius was still continuing his ways and he accepted him back.
Yep.
So even though Arius before came and said, no, I've repented and I've changed, and in that situation, I would think, yeah, but he's repented, so it's okay for him and to come back. But Christ previously said he never to accept it.
Yeah.
So Christ said, don't ever accept it. And then the next pope did that was wrong. And then after again, you hold back the reference, so he wanted to he was.
Yes.
Okay. So sometimes people will think that there is a chance of something to come back. There's actually a chance possible. And I think also, if we think about it from how Christ was looking at the city and saying that he was say, I think we can apply that person and say it's a different person, and Christ looked at the person and say, well, if there's a 10% chance I could save this person, I might save the whole person. Which I think that maybe that's stretched a little bit, but I think that could be a way also.
Yeah. And God knows, He knows who can be saved and who can't. He knows what means and what ability there is. He sees all things. So, that's a good point.
That is as a point where you're saying that we can't know for sure if the tragedy is from God, from Him or not. Actually, he just answers that question directly. And someone asked him about the people who died in the Tower of Siloam, the people who kind of killed him. He said, "You think those people who died in these accidents were more evil than the others?" And just told him, "No, they were not." And so he didn't really even give an explanation. So if they were not more evil than why they died, but he then continued to mention, "But unless you repent, you shall die." So basically, well, what you should learn is that we're all going to die, and we might as well just be ready so that when judgment comes, we be found ready in front of God. So, yeah, he just mentioned a very direct tragedy in which an evil person killed a lot of innocent babies, or an accident happened and killed someone. This is really not evil. You don't need to understand anything that happens. Just need to trust God and learn from what happens and take a lesson.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want an analogy for that point of view, again, doctors and cancer is the topic of the day. A patient who comes in has lung cancer. He's been smoking 30 years in his life. And a patient who comes in never smoked a day in his life and has lung cancer. Does the doctor treat the two of them differently? No, the doctor goes in and goes, doesn't matter why it's happened, I treat it. And so it's the same. God doesn't look and says, well, you've been evil your whole life, so therefore, whatever, just let you be destroyed. No, God comes in and says, I need to treat both. I need to remove the evil from both, regardless of how the evil came about. And so same for us. The response is always the same. It doesn't matter how the wrath of God came about to be. What matters is what's the response we have to that wrath. Is that it returns us to God. It brings us back to the bosom of the Father. That's the most important part. Anything else? Any other points or questions? No? Shall we stand up for prayer? Can I end this?